notice, of course, how central is Eros in the everything that we've talked about in the first part of this talk, in the tantric symbolism and language, in the kabbalistic symbology and language, in the relationship with the world of sense experience opening up, in the movement towards the transcendent, in the re-enchanting of the world, in the very relationship with the world, all of that. So Eros, when it is allowed to do its thing, when it is allowed to inseminate, impregnate, galvanize the soul-making dynamic, the mutual fertilization of Eros, Psyche, Logos, the mutual complication, enrichment, deepening, widening, then it will affect the notion of the path and of awakening, the sense and the vision of what that is, and also the relationship with the senses and sense experience, with the world, with life, and also, of course, with sexuality. So it's interesting historically, and I'm definitely not a historian, but it's interesting to notice, for example, in Buddhism, the rise of Tantra historically, as a historical evolution after the initial so-called the first turning of the wheel in the Pali Canon, and the Buddhist Tantra came afterwards. And in Judaism as well, you have Song of Songs, etc., and other allusions earlier in the history of the text, with the emergence of the kabbalah in the Middle Ages, and also of Hasidism in Eastern Europe in about the 17th century, and after that, which started as a very radical, mystical, kind of ecstatic movement, a real revolution, if you like, in within the stream of Judaism, of Orthodox Judaism, and now has, I think, seems to have become something rather more conservative, and really not so radical in that sense. But in Judaism, there's this, in Buddhism and in Judaism, there's a gradual emergence or ascent or elevation of Eros historically. Also in Islam, I think, with Rumi and Ibn Arabi pointing to these kind of things. In Christianity, which maybe we'll come back to, although some people would argue that it was there right from the beginning in Jesus' relationship either with Mary Magdalene or the so-called disciple that Jesus loved, which might have been another man. But in terms of the what might have got then squeezed out, in terms of what's mainstream Orthodox and historically sort of entrenched, and then in time, historically, gradual ascent, usually at the sides in the esoteric, sort of more elitist, if you like, streams of the tradition. There was a gradual ascent of Eros. It seems that way to me, just looking historically, and I could be wrong, so that Eros becomes actually more integral to the whole vision. It's given a more central place in spiritual experience, in the path, in these different traditions, and in the whole conceptual framework. Now, of course, many people would look at that and, for example, look at Buddhism and say as a deterioration from the sort of purity of the Pali Canon, as a pollution in time, a devolution, or people might look at it that way, but we could also say that it's a necessary evolution. There's something operating in all these diverse spiritual traditions that's kind of manifesting humanity's, if you like, spiritual genius, let's call it that. The intuition that reaches out and kind of gropes in some way to formulate, to articulate, to create and discover a way of including Eros more centrally, sanctifying it, and also metta and also sexuality. So I wonder about seeing it that way. And it's interesting also, I could speak for myself and maybe for other people. I wonder if this reflects, so you can see a historical evolution, but you could also maybe see for some people a personal evolution in their practice, and in their conception and what their eros is directed towards, and what eros is taken to mean, and where it moves, and then in the whole vision of the path, etc. If the soul-making dynamic is allowed, Eros, Psyche, Logos, this is what will happen. It will start to re-evaluate, reconfigure the relationship with the senses, with the world, with sexuality, and in that with the whole path and goal of awakening. All of that. So it may happen on a personal level, and it may happen on a historical level over centuries. And it's interesting to see how they can mirror each other. Usually I think, I can't remember when it was, I talked about Nietzsche's phrase. I think his phrase was the myth of origins. And we tend, highlighting the fact that we tend to assume, or most people tend to assume, that the first birth of a religion, of a philosophy or an ideology is the most pure, the most authentic, the most radical, as in radix, as in root, and the most powerful, and therefore kind of try to scrape away historical accretions or cultural accretions and try to return to some kind of hypothetical original form in the present, or actually have a fantasy and kind of reconstruct that vision in the present. Or mixed with that, they're actually bringing the fantasy and preconceptions in and just take what doesn't challenge the current popular metaphysics, and take that from this supposedly pure original version, being the most radical, etc., the most powerful. Or actually just look at it in a way that the history and the knowledge of history just deconstruct the whole thing with one's an historical analysis, so that the whole edifice and the whole religious impulse and the whole religious creation and construction becomes devalued, dismissed. Any religion, any philosophy can just be deconstructed historically in a way that it's rendered almost valueless. There's a certain way of approaching it that way, a certain intention of approaching it that way. But this Nietzsche pointed to this myth of origins, assuming that the first birth is the most pure, the most authentic, most radical, etc. Why not, though? Why not regard religions and philosophies teleologically? We've talked about that word before, the telos, the aim. Where are they headed? What are they drawn to? So that the evolutions of, in this case, the different religions or Buddhism or whatever it is, and the telos is actually regarded as more authentic, more true, more radical, and more essential. This is upside down in the usual way we think. But in other periods of history, Aristotle and after that, this was regarded as a very valid way of thinking about causality. And what about, is it possible to actually turn the whole thing on its head and see it differently? So whether it's slowly, gradually, or suddenly, human beings think, reflect, intuit, experiment, create, and discover religious forms and practical forms and practices and conceptual frameworks and experiences that actually are part of an evolution, a moving towards something. As Michelangelo said of sculpture, he's can't remember the exact words, but he's just removing the bits of the marble to reveal something that's already there, the statue that's already there in the marble. It's moving towards something, so to speak. I don't know if that's a very good analogy, actually, but the historical currents and events then are not so much regarded in a way that devalues and deconstructs and then dismisses, but we could even go a stage further and regard them too as the operation of some greater intelligence. So even if there are historical factors coming in and adding to something and shaping and reformulating at different periods in the history and the evolution of a tradition, of a religion, even that could be regarded, for instance, as the kind of intelligence of the world soul operating to inform and influence the evolution, if you like. All that is an intelligent operation of the world soul towards a telos, towards some goal. But that goal, unlike, if you know Hegel's philosophy, unlike that, the goal is actually open-ended. So what's that? To have a telos, to have a goal, but actually it's open-ended. One never finally reaches it. There's this open-ended movement, but the evolution is regarded as towards more authenticity, if you like, towards more purity, towards more the radicality. Why can we not regard things that way? Actually, slight aside, but relevant. Despite what I've just said, I know that there are quite a few people around who believe a sort of the initial some old scholarship around Buddhist tantras, which stated that they were just Buddhist tantrism was basically borrowed from or evolved from Shivite Hindu tantrism, and it was just a derivative thing, and therefore the whole vajrayana was again historical devolution, a pollution of the pure original Buddhist teaching by alien influences in India, etc., like that. And in more recent scholarship, for example, Bhattacharya and others actually have pointed to it being quite the other way round. That in their research, indicating that Buddhist tantras actually had a big influence on the evolution of Hindu tantrism. But that's all, and in fact that. Mantras and dharanis and mandalas and mudras and all this kind of tantric notions and practices are actually present in Buddhist texts as early as the 1st century of the Common Era, for example in the Manjushri Mahakalpa and things like that. So that's interesting if we're going to play the game of what's the pure origin of something and regard everything that comes afterwards as a sort of movement away from purity, as opposed to regarding it telistically, teleologically, the other way around, a movement towards more what is authentic, a growth and evolution. But there is, it seems to me, as a non-historian, a gradual ascent, if you like, of Eros historically, and therefore also of sexuality, that it becomes more integrated, less denigrated, more elevated, and instead given place in the whole sort of spiritual outlook and approach, religious practice and thought. So, and you see this in Christianity, for example. There was a 17th century Lutheran called Johann Gichtel, and listen to this for some instructions. To Sophia, we have to explain. Sophia is, find it in the Old Testament, in the Bible, I think in Proverbs as well. Literally means wisdom. It's Greek for wisdom, but she is regarded as the first first, if you like, being or that God created. She was with God and God's love almost from the beginning, so to speak. So she's not God, but she's somehow divine and, if you like, part of God or something like that. So there's different kind of ideation around who exactly she is, but she's a feminine kind of quasi-divine figure of devotion and prominent in different streams within the Christian tradition. Listen to this from Johann Gichtel in the 17th century. To Sophia, as the essential love, make yourself more united, more known. So these are instructions for a practitioner. Make yourself more united, more known to Sophia. And while praying, focus your imagination on her as you do on your wife, and give yourself over to her way of loving with your body, soul, and spirit. Give yourself over to her way of loving with your body, soul, and spirit. You will find within your soul a great relief and sweetness, and an excellent strength in your prayer. And actually wrapped up in this teaching about Sophia is a whole what we could call cosmology or cosmopoesis in our outlook. And he says that, he points out that Sophia's presence is regarded as permeating the created world. The skies, the plants, the flowers, the metals, everything. So that, he writes, we also recognize Sophia in this created world, since she is emanated in the heavens and on the earth, and in everything that grows, and is to be seen and found on the firmament, and likewise in herbs, flowers, their colors, odors, taste, or virtues, also in metals of the earth and their tinctures. So there is, one can sense in there's a whole actual quite elaborate conceptual framework and theology involved in Sophia and relationship with the world and levels of existence and what's called in the Hermetic and other traditions sympathies, harmonic resonances between, for example, metals and their tinctures and certain herbs and colors and odors and tastes with if you like, spiritual dimensions. However, Johann Gichtel and the other theosophists that had a similar kind of outlook in relation to Sophia and erotic relations with Sophia in the imaginal prayer, still often regarded actual physical sensual relations, even within the context of marriage, as much less preferable. Somehow there's still a bias and perhaps a result of entrenched views regarding sexuality and the so-called battle against the flesh, which is such a entrenched notion in well, both Western and Eastern thought. Goes back to Plato, probably even before that, and reflected in the monotheistic traditions, etc. But it's striking to listen to that as a kind of imaginal meditation instruction, similar to what we've been talking about. And I'm also, what comes to mind is a piece of writing by Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk who died, I think, in 1968. Beautiful writer, beautiful person. And he has a really gorgeous piece called, I think it's called Hagia Sophia, if you ever come across it. And he describes waking up in a hospital bed with a nurse there, and kind of by his bedside opens his eyes and sees this nurse, and sees in her face and in her manner and the tenderness of her ministrations, he sees Sophia. He perceives her theophanically, something very, very beautiful there, and he weaves a beautiful piece of writing around that. And I wonder how much that perception there was a result, again, of the personal evolution of his practice. I don't know enough about where he came from. He certainly was living as a celibate monk, a Trappist monk, very strict order at that time. I'm told that he had, or I heard somewhere else, that then he did in fact end up having some kind of presumably unconsummated relationship or friendship with a nurse. And I'm just wondering, again, what the play there was of imaginal theophanic perception tied into a beautiful, mystical, multidimensional theology and conceptual framework and vision, and then actually allowed to permeate the human relations and still open to that multidimensionality. I don't know. In Christian Gnostic traditions, and I'm aware there's a lot of confusion around what that word Gnosticism means and whether it even actually really refers to anything. But there's a text called The Greater Questions of Mary, and here it describes Jesus in the presence of Mary, who's probably Mary Magdalene, produced a woman from his side, began to have intercourse with her, and partook of his emission, meaning that he ate his ejaculate, his semen, partook of his emission to show that, quote, thus we must do that we may live. Thus we must do that we may live. So that's a very striking kind of depiction of scenario there. You'll notice just, how in these historic texts, how heteronormal the bias is. So there is that bias there, and it's reflected in the text and the depictions here. But one wonders, in this Greater Questions of Mary, and that image there of Jesus doing that, is this talking about an imaginal practice, that one does this imaginally? Is it talking about an actual practice, actually having, I mean, you can't actually produce a woman from your side, but maybe actually having sex and actually partaking and eating of the sexual fluids, etc. And apparently there were certain sects, I think one sect was called the Barbarites, which actually did that as part of their religious practice and ritual. So is it imaginal practice it's referring to? Is it actual practice, or is it just metaphorical and representational, if you like, a reference to semen? Because in a lot of Gnostic texts, apparently, the divine element in humans that must be gathered during the process of salvation was metaphorically called semen. So maybe these Jesus and the woman and the intercourse and the semen, these are all just symbolic metaphors. So what is it? An imaginal practice, an actual practice, a metaphor? And people would interpret it, apparently, historically, they've interpreted it very differently. Similarly, in Buddhist Tantra, so the beginning of the Guhya Samaja Tantra, the opening lines of the Guhya Samaja Tantra, which is the root, the most important Tantra in the for many Tibetan Buddhists, but particularly for the Gelug tradition, which is the tradition of the Dalai Lama. It starts like this, and I've heard that most tantras, or at least many tantras, start with the same opening line. Evam maya shrutam, this is Sanskrit, Evam maya shrutam, thus have I heard. Kasmin samai bhagavan, sarva tathagata kaya vakchita hridaya vajra yoshit bhageshu ujahara. Which means, actually, one of the things about this is it can mean many different things. And like I said before, it's something to do with the way Sanskrit can kind of fit words together. So you can have lots of different permutations of what it might mean. And I would say that plurality of possible meanings is implicit in the Sanskrit, in the constructions, is intended. So it invites the reader into a kind of poetic participation with the text, an exploration also that implies a practice, a meditative encounter with the text that must include a flexibility of imagination, view, and conceptual constructs. So it's not just a text you read for sort of information. It's multifaceted, and you enter into a text like this these multiple meanings as a kind of offering of different meditative stances, if you like. A door is open to different meditative possibilities, imaginal and conceptual. In the very kind of polysemous possibilities of the language. So that whole, if you like, intrinsically ambiguous or polysemic articulation, it supports not just a poetic and practical approach and a sort of openness of interpretability, it also supports a whole conception and view of the image or of any perception of reality as multi-leveled, not singular, possessive instead of many faces all at once, none of which have an existence independent of the mind, but which are, if you like, only elicited or activated by the way of looking or interpreting that the mind has in that moment in relationship with this image. So there's parallels here could be parallels with tantric and vajrayana language in the tantras and kind of what we're talking about with the imaginal practices, and also, as I've referred to in the past, with kabbalistic teachings regarding the Bible and other sacred texts. But if we go back to that Sanskrit opening line, thus have I heard, Ekasmi Samaya Bhagavan, on one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling in, now you could translate it, in the vaginas of the, the vaginas of the diamond maidens of the heart essence of the body, speech and mind of all Tathagatas. At one time the Blessed One was dwelling in the vaginas of the diamond maidens, in or of the heart essence of the body, speech and mind of all Tathagatas. That word that I'm translating as vagina, that actually is often translated as vagina bhaga, it too has many possible meanings. So it can actually it can mean vagina, it can also mean enjoyment or happiness or prosperity, it can mean place or inheritance, it can also mean love and sexual passion. So it's a multi-faceted word. But it's an interesting choice of word there, and that together with all the tantric symbolism, etc. Now you get commentaries on the tantras, on this kind of sentence there, which assign each word sort of different levels of meaning. And so they would say that the bhaga really refers to the clear light mind, or emptiness, or this or that. So that the Buddha was residing in the clear light of emptiness, etc. And it would each of these words would have different levels of meaning. But again, we're left with this, well, what actually is the Buddhist Tantrism getting at with its references, its sexual symbology and references and languages there? And again, like we talked about in the iconography of the yabyum, the sexual union of Buddha and his consort. Is it just symbolic? So that's one option, is that the eros depicted, I will refer to the sexuality, the sexual, whatever it is, fluids or organs or energy that are referred to. Are these just symbols? So that, for example, the yabyum, the sexual union of the Buddha and the consort is just the union of wisdom and means that we talked about before, and it's just a symbol for that. It's only a symbol. And so you get commentators who insist on that. This has nothing to do with sexuality, nothing to do with that. It's purely a symbol for spiritual orientations or realities or unions, etc. But one possibility is it's symbolic, or perhaps only symbolic. Another possibility is that sexuality, sexual energy, etc., is regarded in Tantra, or used in Tantra, as a vehicle, so it's purely practical, as a means, an expedient means. It's just because it's a powerful energy which, when gathered and channeled in the body and in the energy body, can give rise to great bliss and actually shifts in consciousness. So this is, again, very common presentation of the tantric relationship or view of sexuality, sexual energy, sexual fluids, etc. Is just really that you're gathering a certain very powerful energy, and because of its power, because sexuality is regarded as the most powerful energy that a human being has or is subject to, it's powerful enough that if it's gathered in a certain way, channeled in a certain way, preserved in a certain way, and then channeled, it can bring this bliss and a shift in consciousness. Now, for some, actually, it's just about the bliss, in the kind of pop versions. Or a shift in consciousness is possible that will enable the consciousness to open to emptiness or clear light without having to do a lot of other practices which are harder and take longer, etc., to develop. But this is a second possibility, that the tantric perspective and relationship with sexuality and sexual energy is really just as a vehicle. And if it was another energy in human beings, or that human beings were subject to, that was more powerful and was more expedient, I don't know what that would be, eating chocolate or whatever, then they would just use that instead. So there's nothing about sexuality per se that's interesting, other than it's just a vehicle. It's just a means of getting to A to B that's kind of a turbocharged one. A turbocharged vehicle, if you like. So that would be a second possibility. Or is the tantric view and relationship and conception of and regard of sexuality and eros, is it actually attempting a re-sanctification, a re-enchanting, a divinizing, perhaps a kind of transubstantiation, but certainly a re-sanctification, a re-enchanting, a divinizing of what was often seen before that as not holy, not sacred? Re-sanctification of sexuality, which was regarded as a defilement. So, symbol only of something spiritual, a vehicle, or a re-sanctification of sexuality itself, a re-inclusion of sexuality itself in itself. So with the vehicle, it's not that sexuality is itself holy, because it's just an expedient means. It could be replaced by anything. But in the third option, it's actually that sexuality itself is being re-sanctified. So people have very different interpretations of tantric texts and teachings and all that. Or is it all three? Is it all three? That it is symbolic, that it has this multi-dimensional, multi-leveled sort of resonances and reflections, sexuality, eros, sexual imagery, that yes, we are certainly it could be a re-sanctification and also a vehicle. For us, at least for how we are thinking of it, I would say it's all three. It does have this multi-leveled, multi-dimensionality to it of symbology, of what the image kind of reflects, what the eros, how it's mirrored. And it is most certainly a re-sanctification. I would like to see it that way. There's a widening, a deepening, an extending of what is regarded as sacred, re-enchanting of the cosmos, and very much part of that is the view and the relationship of sexuality. and not just in a one-dimensional human way as expressing love and our right to pleasure. And as a vehicle, except that for us the vehicle is not so much about the energy. I mean, that's fine, and I would actually say there's more possibilities there with the energetics there, because you can take any opening of the energy body in a number of different directions if you know how to navigate it. But primarily the vehicle for us is as a vehicle of soul-making, because the eros and the sexual imagery and the erotic-imaginal actually impregnate the imagery, give it dimensionality, and open up that soul-making and open up the divinizing, the perception of dimensionality and divinity. So it's a vehicle in that sense, but it's a vehicle for the imaginal and the soul-making. But in all this you can see in these examples I've been given from the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition and the Buddhist Tantra tradition, that sexuality is kind of reflected in and reflects and implicated in and involved in and affects the perception of cosmos, world and divinity. So there's a kind of mirroring here. We've talked about this in these different examples. So the human sexual, as I said, reflects, mirrors, expresses, manifests, affects the cosmos, the world, and the divine. So I remember an image. I shared one very small part of the image a few talks ago, and it was where the beautiful woman took my hands and placed them in the prayer posture, and then mirrored that with our fingertips touching, and drew my attention to our relationship rather than what part of me wanted to get caught up in some larger political issue. Following on from that, what happened in that image is, at one point I take the sun out of my heart. The sun feels like it's right at my heart center, in the center of my chest is this really radiant, bright sun, and I take it out of my heart center to give it to her. It feels like I want to do that as an offering of love, and it seems natural to the image. It seems so at first, but then I become unsure in two respects. One is, I'm unsure if I'm making this up. If I think, where did I get this from? Is it that I maybe was looking at some alchemical text briefly and I've just forgotten about it? I certainly didn't recall ever seeing anything like that, but I somehow become suspicious that it's just some idea I got from something that alchemy or Jung or something or other. And secondly, it just feels like it's not the right thing to do. In terms of the first kind of suspicion or hesitation there, I would make the point now, this was a few years ago, but now it seems clear to me that it absolutely doesn't matter if that idea or that gesture or that movement was stimulated or seeded by something I had read somewhere in some text or something, or flicked through, or seen a picture or whatever it was, something similar to that. It does not matter. That doesn't make it unauthentic. What matters is the soul making. So whether the idea, people sometimes would be more impressed if I really hadn't seen anything like that before, and then I found it in an alchemical text, and this is the sort of thing Jung would do quite a lot, and point to the reality of universal archetypes, etc. For me, it doesn't matter. What matters is the soul making. And there's an acknowledgement that that soul making can be fed, and sometimes mysteriously so, by anything at all, by ideation, by reading, by hearing teachings, by dreams, by whatever it is. More important was the second objection. It just felt somehow, as I did it, that actually this is not the right thing to do. And more important was that the sun stayed in my heart. That was part of preserving the polarity, in fact. Because later, she seems to have the moon in her heart center. And this kind of gave another dimension to the polarity. There's the sun in my heart center and the moon in hers. And there's this attraction between sun and moon, and polarity there between sun and moon, but also a kind of balance. And all that is mirrored somehow in our erotic-imaginal relating. The attraction, the polarity, and the balance. And in that, it seemed like that attraction, balance, and polarity had kind of what I would now call cosmopoetic overtones. And again, later this spilled out into the world in terms of the cosmopoesis. So this image stayed for a few days, and it sort of came back in different meditations, or I brought it back, but oftentimes it would just come back, and it was more involved erotically, etc., with some sexual imagery, etc. And I remember at that time trying to kind of, I could feel my mind trying to kind of grasp intellectually what was going on. What does this mean? What does this sun and what does this moon represent? And trying to fix this or that meaning. And kind of letting go of that a little bit, and more getting an intuitive, sort of vague and subtle sense of this sun and moon, and this polarity and this balance. It was reflecting something cosmic. It was reflecting a kind of cosmic harmony or relationship, or a part or a dimension, if you like, of of some kind of cosmic harmony. And that harmony and relationship was sort of existed already as a perception. So it wasn't that. It wasn't that this was kind of saying something about me and my psychological balance, etc., balancing sun and moon and male and masculine and feminine and all that. I was trying to make it sort of mean something like that, but just relaxing a little bit and actually getting a sense of, this is something beyond just the personal, let's put it that way. It was already existing as a kind of cosmic balance that was already present to be realized and appreciated, rather than telling me something about what I needed to do to rebalance myself or something like that. That was the sense of it. And also in that sense, in that kind of cosmic multi-dimensional, multi-level sort of mirroring, there was a sense then, of course, of the cosmos not being separate from me, not being separate from my imagination. So again, something in the erotic-imaginal, mirroring and reflecting something, a level of the cosmos, of the divine. And we can say there's a kind of alchemy, there's a kind of magic going on there, but it's in the perception, in the sense of the world and of the human being. Right? That's the kind of alchemy and magic that we're interested in. And again, there's another text, a Hermetic text called the Asclepius, and very old text, and it describes, or it states that the act of sexual union between two lovers is a divine mystery. That sex itself is a divine mystery, not only, it says, because it's an image, it's a mirroring of the productivity and the androgynous unity of God. That means the transgender or bigender, hermaphroditic nature of God being neither male nor female, both and neither, etc. Again, actually, in this text, there's still the sort of heteronormal bias there, normalizing bias of heterosexual orientations. But this is hopefully a progress in history where the logos, the ideation, the image of what sexuality can be, etc., might be hopefully growing. But the act of sexual union in this text is a divine mystery, not just because it's an image of the productivity and androgynous unity of God, but also because it is actually possible for both of the lovers to experience that original androgyny. In other words, to experience another dimension, if you like, of their being, but also of God's being, of the divine being. It continues, though, but for ignorant and irreverent people, sex, it is a mere act of the flesh. So again, it's something that a certain logos, a certain way of looking, a certain reverential approach transubstantiates something, transforms the perception of something, opens up a vision, is discovered there. Dimensionality and a divinity is discovered in the sexuality. And I don't know if you ever have had the sense of actual sex as a kind of act of cosmic and divine mirroring. So the actual participation in something that's much bigger, something of the human sexuality, reflecting, mirroring, echoing, participating in something much larger and much more multidimensional, cosmic and divine dimensions in the very sexuality, in the very sex. Quite possible. That Hermetic text, Asclepius, also says that the act of sexual union mirrors the union of the human being with the divine. So there's all kinds of mirroring going on. You get this sense in a lot of these traditions and texts, something emerging that's kind of pointing to a multi-level, multi-dimensional, multifaceted mirroring, echoing, reflecting interconnectedness, inner and outer. It's all interconnected, mirroring, influencing each other. This word participation, there's a mutual participation that's multi-leveled and multi-dimensional. This chitta, this mind and heart, this soul, this body, it participates in the soul, if you like, the body of the cosmos and of the divine. Participation, this chitta, your chitta, my soul, my body, your body, participating in mirroring, influencing, completely connected, the inner and the outer, the personal and the universal, the human and the divine, the material and the spiritual. But this is a way of looking. It's an invitation to a way of looking, rather than, as I'm sure it can sound very easily, just some very abstract and very strange idea. It's an invitation to a way of looking. We can make this a reality. In the sense you make it, you open to it as an experience by entertaining certain ways of looking. Through the imaginal perception, through the attitude, through the heartfulness, through the soul-making looking. soul-making sensing. It becomes actually lived and actually materialized. The spiritualization of matter, the materialization of spirit. Apparently in many, I think, medieval Jewish prayer books, there was an Aramaic formula that preceded certain prayers, or many of the prayers, and some or all of the ritual commandments, what's called the mitzvot, in the prayer book. And it said something like, liturgy is performed, or this or that is performed, for the sake of the union of the Holy One, blessed be He, with His Shekhinah, with the divine presence or the immanence. So this prayer that I'm going to say now, this ritual that I'm going to do, whatever it is, washing my hands or eating bread or drinking wine or whatever, this is performed for the sake of the union of the Holy One with His Shekhinah, His divine immanence, His immanence. So again, this marrying of the levels, the transcendent and the immanent. Erotic imagery, erotic language running through these different traditions and emphasized again and again the multi-leveled, multifaceted, multi-reflecting nature of all this. And one wonders, historically, and I don't know enough about it, what that then was taken to imply by different people at different times and different places in history and these different traditions, what that was taken to imply for the nature and the place of human eros and sexuality, and what it was taken to imply for the meaningfulness, all this erotic sexual description of the divine realms, and the meaning of prayer and what that does, and other rituals and actions, reflecting, influencing, etc. But what was that taken to mean regarding the meaningfulness, the nature, the place of human eros and sexuality? It seems to me, and again, I'm really not a historian, that there was a lot of tension in that question and a lot of ambivalence historically around what it actually meant or implied for actual human sexual relations. But even that aside, all this is really quite different, I think, from the way we're used to thinking of things in this era of modernism and secular modernism and humanism, secular humanism. So I was raised in London, had an Orthodox Jewish upbringing, very very strict, and had to do follow all these rules and rituals, and you can't do this on the Sabbath, and you have to do this, and you have to wear that, and you can't, a lot of rules, but it was all, the whole explanation of it that I was given in that Jewish education in my family and at school, it was all very literal, and all actually very one-dimensional, in fact. And so there was a lot of fear as a young child, a fear of breaking these rules and these commandments and God being angry and punishing you and all this kind of stuff. And it was kind of enforced, both at the school and in my family home. And it seemed to me at a certain point, I really rebelled against it, that there was just a lot of I's being dotted and T's being crossed, or whatever the phrase is. A lot of kind of very particular attention to details that seemed, I didn't have the language perhaps at the time, just seemed to be lacking a whole level, amplitude, or dimensionality of meaning and resonance there. It was just this kind of literal, one-dimensional fulfilling of certain commandments. A lot of them seemed completely bizarre. And just as soon as I hit my teenage years, I think, pretty soon, I became an atheist, and just the whole thing didn't just seemed stupid to me, and I was a sort of secret atheist, and then a much less secret one. Interesting in atheism is also just in the grip of a very literalist view. So there's a literalist view of all these what's called the mitzvot, the commandments, the rituals, etc. And there's a literalist view of how silly they are. And it's taking the whole thing, the sense of divinity and the sense of the rituals and what they're for and all that, just both sides are just literalisms arguing with each other. Compare that with the more Kabbalistic or mystical kind of relationship with, reviewing of, participatory understanding of these rules and ritual elements, etc. in Judaism. So I'm going to paraphrase a writer called Daniel Matt, who writes about Jewish mysticism, but I could have picked quite a few other writers. So this is quite a minority view within the Jewish religion, but it's reflective of the certain strands of mysticism within that. And I'll paraphrase what he writes. So Kabbalah, he says, constructs its mythical realm out of the elements of Jewish law. In other words, here is the elements of Jewish law, these rules and rituals that one is told that just come down to one. Some of them seem pretty bizarre. And rather what the Kabbalah does is this spiritual genius of approaching something that's given and giving it, creating and discovering whole other dimensions of meaningfulness, invigorating it with life in a participatory way. So Kabbalah constructs its mythical realm out of the elements of Jewish law. The commands of the ruler of the world become instead sacraments and mystery rites that simultaneously reflect and influence the pulsating life of the universe. Sacraments and mystery rites that simultaneously reflect and influence the pulsating life of the universe. The code of law becomes a secret code. Judaism is transformed into a mystery religion. Symbolic and magical aspects of the mitzvot, the ritual commandments, are alternately emphasized. Symbolic and magical alternately emphasized. The mystic integrates himself, again, gender-biased language, the mystic integrates himself into the pattern of the cosmos and stimulates the flow of divine emanation. Integrates himself into the pattern of the cosmos and stimulates the flow of emanation. His ritual act represents the divine and calls it forth, represents the divine and calls it forth. Not a rationalization of these laws in earthly terms. For example, you can only eat this because it's actually better for your health, or you can't eat that because it's not good for you, or whatever it is. The Kabbalists expand the dimensions. It's not just rational and earthly now. The human actor is now a protagonist in the cosmic drama. The mitzvot are literally the essence of life, according to the Kabbalist Joseph Gikatila. His life and God's life. They are not reducible to autonomous reason. It's not just kind of, you can think of as a practical kind of humanistic reasons for them, nor are they simply imposed heteronomously. In other words, a sort of separate God just says, you better do this, and watch out if you don't. As extensions of the divine qualities, the commandments, the mitzvot, the ritual acts, permeate the universe and constitute its fabric. What a different view that is, and the beauty, the fullness, the multidimensionality of that creative engagement with this received tradition to give it whole other dimensions of life there, whole other dimensions of beauty. So this is different than a kind of view of ritual that if we don't do X ritual, whatever, the sun won't rise tomorrow, or whatever, which is clearly not true and quite provable to be not true. Excuse me. So it's not that kind of literalism, and it's neither the literalism of that kind of one-dimensionality of the child's view of ritual, or the simplistic atheist kind of literalism. How do we conceive? How do we look at the elements that we are given? How do we look at life, action, our human being, divinity? How do we conceive of these in ways that are soul-making, in the broadest possible range and depth? In the Zohar, and these Kabbalistic the Zohar is an ancient Kabbalistic text from the early Middle Ages, I think, 12th century, I think. In the Zohar, again, this understanding is offered that the purpose of practice, spiritual practice, religious practice, the purpose, not just meaning prayer, but meaning action, etc. The purpose is to mirror and affect the divine. Purpose is to mirror and affect the divine. So in the Zohar, it says, in every commandment, in every mitzvah, your effort is to unite the Blessed Holy One and His Shekhinah. So that this transcendent aspect of divinity with the immanence, with the divinity that permeates the world. Yes, you're in every ritual action. Your effort is to unite the Blessed Holy One and His Shekhinah, and this divine immanence, so that mystical understanding and enactment of the commandments, of the mitzvot, if we're just staying in the Jewish tradition, for example, in our language we would say mystical understanding and enactment of the mitzvot. We could say that the conceptual frameworks and the ways of looking we entertain, we skillfully use in our life, in our meditation practice, open up perceptions, and also our action and our embodiment in the world, when they are, and the world is seen as divine, as a divine creation, with that sense of duty and with that sense of participation. In the words of the Zohar, they serve to light up the Queen. The Queen is this divine immanence, the Shekhinah, this female aspect of God. Light up the Queen, to strip her of the dark clothes of literalness. Strip her of the dark clothes of literalness and adorn her with garments of shining colors of the mysteries of Torah. So, again, Torah is a Jewish word. We could say, strip the world of the dark clothes of literalness, and adorn her with garments of shining colors of the mysteries of the divine, or if you like, of the mysteries of the mandala, of the mysteries of the Buddha's kaya vacchitta, body, speech and mind. The mysteries of the Buddha nature. So it's a similar principle through the engagement of the erotic-imaginal. It's a whole different way of entering into and relating to and conceiving of and practicing whatever it is, meditation, prayer, action in the world, embodiment, speech, all the beauty of that, the poetry of that, impregnating it with this soul-making potential, seed, life. So in this view, in this opening, in this soul-making perspective, the cosmos is erotic and divine. And the Eros is divine. And we are implicated in that divine erotic cosmos, or divine cosmic Eros. We are implicated in that. We reflect that. We echo it. It echoes us. We express it. We manifest it. We are involved. We are called on and we are necessary. in and through our perception, our imaginal perception, our practice, our meditative perception, our ways of looking, in and through our perception, and in and through our action. So again, this is not a naive belief in the power of ritual or magic in some kind of very naive way, if there are even such people anymore who believe like that, which I'm sure there are. Not so much that, as an alchemy of perception, an alchemy of the perception of the cosmos and of the human being. So it's not just intrapsychic psychology we're dealing with here. There's something about that's inseminating and fueling and firing up an alchemical process that involves our whole perception of ourselves, of each other, and of the whole cosmos. So in and through perception and in and through action, and that can include our eros, our erotics, and our sexual acts, our actual sexual participation. So in other words, if we're including our action in this, then we can include the sexual actions as well, potentially. Not only symbol, they can be seen in this way too, in this larger soul-making way too. Eros, whether it's in the meditation, in the imaginal perception, in the way we're relating to the senses and the way we move and act and embody in the world, whether it's actually in our sexual relations, the Eros, as we've been saying all along, it brings with it the possibility of stimulating and increasing the soul-making and expanding, enriching, deepening the sense of the sacred. There is then the tikkun haolam, the healing of the world in the perception. In the perception. So that we have this, we have a kind of place in the cosmos then. And our perception, our thoughts, our vision, our ideation, our speech and action, our embodiment, our sexuality, kind of, you could say, has multi-leveled function. But there, and we have a place where integrated then is not necessarily the heavy kind of responsibility. It's actually quite light because we see it's all empty. This is not a realist view. We're seeing image as image. But if we can find the way into this through the practice and through that opening up the logos and the imaginal perception and the whole ways of looking, then in the very non-realism of it, and through that, and through all that opening up, the world can be, it's sacralized, it's re-sacralized. The world is sacralized and becomes infinitely revealing. The world is a world of infinite revelation. There's no end to the revelation in the world, that the world is. The revelation of soul, of divinity, of Buddha nature. And the world, through this, these practices and the ways of conceiving and entering, the world is sacralized and becomes potentially infinitely revealing through our perception and through our embodiment, including sexual. Very different than an objectified world. Sacralized, infinitely deep, infinitely opening, infinitely revealing, rather than just one-dimensional objects and the objectification of that. What is the difference in the embodiment there, the erotic embodiment of the pilgrim versus the tourist or the vacationer, as we've said many times now? This sacralization and this infinite revelation happens through the Eros. To say how central that is, the Eros. One last thing. In the creation of the divine, if you like, in the healing of the divine, in the creation of the Buddha nature, which is implicit in what we've been presenting, in the creation, in the creation and discovery of the imaginal dimensions of the self, aspects of the self, of the other, of the world, in the erotic moving towards, the erotic movement towards what is beyond, what is not yet quite known, the moving towards the angel out ahead, in Korban's words, never quite reaching it, because the angel is always out ahead and keeps moving on itself, or in never remaining, at least, in union with the angel or what is beyond. In all this, there's a kind of infinite movement, or infinite potential of movement, potentially infinite movement, as we've talked about with the Eros Psyche Logos dynamic. There's telos here, there's moving towards, but that's open-ended. What I want to draw attention to in that now is the fact that all of this creation of divinity, this creation of self, other world, this moving, the Eros moving towards, beyond, to the not yet known, always this infinite movement, it implies the dynamism of becoming. It implies time. In this movement, time, growth, if you like, telos, the dynamism of becoming, temporal becoming, is seen to be holy. It's bhava, it's becoming, but it's not realist. And at the same time, as well, there is also the timelessness here. There's also the dimension of timelessness, of eternity, that we know, as I've pointed out, in the iconic nature of the imaginal, that we feel that timelessness, that eternal quality, as well as in the unfabricated, that which is beyond time. So something in all this kind of gives a sanctity and a place and an importance and a holiness to both the dynamism of becoming and the temporal, and to the timeless and the eternity. If we go back to that line from Gregory of Nyssa, for the thirst of human souls requires some infinite water. How could this limited world suffice? How could this limited world suffice? So yes, beyond the world, beyond the limited world into the transcendent, into the unfabricated, beyond the senses, beyond perception, beyond experience, beyond space, beyond time. Yes, know that. And all the levels going up to that of different kinds of oneness. The eros for the transcendent, the thirst of human souls requires some infinite water. Yes, the transcendent, but yes, also the world sacralized. Why? Because, as I said, it's potentially infinite in its revelations, infinitely revealing, infinitely opening. Through the eros, this limited world becomes an unlimited world, or in the form of limitation, infinite depths are revealed. So both the transcendent, away from the world, and and the world too, but the world reviewed, seen through the heart of soul-making. And both those directions provide us with infinite water. And we can actually move in both of those. We can drink from both of those streams. And in a way, this is what